Okay, good morning everyone.
Good morning.
So thank you very much for coming to our public lecture here held by History Department of UIIN, and I would like to welcome our most welcome and also respected Professor Farish A Noor here. So it's really our pleasure to welcome you here at our History Department and to give your very recent work. This is actually the book that is supposed to come in the forthcoming. Right? It's still in the process of presentation with Leiden University, the visual of empire. So it is really fortunate for us to hear it first before the book gets published by the Leiden University. So thank you very much for bringing your the newest work to our department here. So we are going to have our public lecture here, and this public lecture is also streamed online on YouTube. So later on, you can see it again. You know, if you want to say review about the lecture. But also, I would like to welcome the audience, our audiences who are following on YouTube. And we will have our lecture here for almost 2 hours until 11 o'clock, just before the Friday prayers. And Professor Farish will deliver his speech later for 45 minutes, and the rest of the time we can dedicate it for discussion, questions, and also, you know, of course, discussion. But before we are moving on to our lecture, I would like also to give the opportunity for our chair of head of department of history to give a welcoming speech. And yeah, I would like to give the time for our Dr. Abdul Wahid.
Okay, thank you so much, Billy. Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Semua. So, first of all, on behalf of Department of History, I would like to welcome Professor Farish A Noor. Professor Farish A Noor is a professor of political science in UIII, UIII, so the neighbor of UIII in Depok. So we are very fortunate, and also it is a big honor actually for our department to have you here. Thank you so much for your generosity, spending your time, also sharing your knowledge to our student here. We are the Department of History is always very keen to create a network and cooperation with colleagues from different part of the world, and especially those who are working closely to our focus in history of Indonesia, but also Southeast Asia and Asia in general. And then I'm quite glad to hear that your book is coming out soon. And then we are very lucky here, all of us, to get the preview or sneak peek of the books prior to publication of the book. So, and then hopefully maybe after the book is really launched, published, we can have also another opportunity to discuss the book in different occasions, different time. So, I think this is another program of our Department of History. We have this kind of program regularly, almost every month. And then we are quite happy to have you here. And then we're really looking forward to have another program in the coming future, and also cooperation in research and publications. And then for the students, I think this is a really good opportunity for you as well to see this very interesting topic, right? Connecting the photography, the visual history with our relations with the empire and with the colonization. So it's really intriguing, the questions. Was colonial photography ever innocent? Is there any? Photography is innocent in this world. Anyway, we will hear more about that from this lecture, I guess, and then I hope you can learn a lot from this opportunity, and also from Professor Farish A Noor. So once again, thank you so much, Professor, for your making time for us here. And then we really appreciate it. Unfortunately, I won't be here for your lecture because I have another lecture myself to give at the same time. But we will of course meet again after the lecture. So terima kasih semuanya. Silakan buka buku, buka pikiran, buka telinga untuk menyerap semua informasi yang akan disampaikan Profesor Farish A Noor. Ini adalah kesempatan yang baik untuk semua untuk belajar dan juga mendengarkan penelitian-penelitian terbaru dari para ahli dari dunia akademik internasional. So once again, thank you so much everyone. So enjoy the lecture and then thank you again Profesor Farish. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi semuanya.
Okay, thank you very much, Mas Wahid, for the welcoming, for the welcome speech. And now I would like to proceed to introduce our speakers, the only speakers for today, Professor Farish A Noor. So, Professor Farish A Noor is a professor at political history at the Faculty of Social Science, Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia, UIII, in Depok, Indonesia. And his work has been focusing on the impact of colonialism in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. And he has written extensive work. I cannot mention one by one because it's so much. But his work has been focusing on the power of ideas and how colonization was never simply a case of violent conquest, but also subtle transformation and coercions. And his latest book is The Long Shadow of the Empire of 19th Century. Actually, not the latest now, because there are going to be a latest book on the visual of empire. And then also his book on data collecting in 19th century Colonial Southeast Asia, Framing the Authors, which was published in 2020. I think this is the very fascinating work where he actually using a lot of collected data. So you should run after this book if you're working on the colonial history in the 19th century. And then also another work before the pivot, America's encounter with Southeast Asia in 19th to 20th century. And then you can also find Professor Farish A Noor online because he has a very strong online presence. So he has made several documentaries and numerous other media recording of his lectures, interviews, and presentations. So among many other documentary films on history of Southeast Asia, such as series on Shadows of Empires, Inventing Southeast Asia, and also Invention of the Borneo. This is one of my favorites when you're talking about the headhunters. Yeah, and then also he is on TED Talk. Not very long speech, but it's really enough to provoke our mind to think about why is colonialism still romanticized. So if you're really interested in the colonial history, so you really have to run after his words and also maybe after him after this to have more discussion. So that's why we are very much fortunate to have him here to share about his work on the visual of empire. Was colonial photography ever innocent? I'm not going to prolong my introductions here because I would like you to invite me to welcome to our speaker, Professor Farish A Noor, to deliver his message for the next 45 or 50 minutes. So please give me a round of applause to welcome Professor.
Thank you very much, Yuli, and thank you to all of you for attending this talk. I need to stand up because I have a bad back and I cannot sit for too long. So today I want to talk about the visuals of empire, and allow me to start with a few premises. Yeah. So allow me to begin by laying a few premises. As was mentioned earlier, we in post-colonial Southeast Asia, when we recall the history of colonialism and imperialism in Southeast Asia, in popular terms, particularly in popular media, there is always the tendency to focus on the more violent aspects of colonialism, colonial rule, expansion of empires and what have you. I mean, you don't have to go very far. Go to your Netflix, watch any movie or drama series set during colonial Southeast Asia. More often than not, what you will encounter will be episodes of violence. There is always this tendency to view colonialism in terms of violence. Now, of course, I am not denying that violence took place. We know this, especially in the case of Indonesia. There has been a long history of colonial violence. However, one of the points that I have been pressing for the last 15 years is that empires, all modern empires, are basically bureaucratic, administrative, economic institutions that require normality to set in as soon as possible. And this aspect of colonialism, of colonial rule, is often not highlighted. We look at the image of the colonial soldier, we look at the image of the colonial army, we look at the image of the colonial battleship or warplane. But what we do not see is the colonial bureaucrat. We do not see the colonial accountant. We do not see the colonial postman. We do not see the colonial lawyer. Because that's how empires, modern empires, are run. And perhaps one of the reasons why we do not, or we choose not to, look at that mundane, ordinary aspect of colonial rule, modalities of daily colonial governance, is because it resembles what we have today. And whether we like it or not, the post-colonial state is built on the foundations of the colony. We cannot escape that. We cannot escape that. So what I've been doing, and Yuli mentioned the books I've been working on. I mean, allow me to state from the outset that my background is not actually philosophy. I mean, not actually history. My background is philosophy, right? Philosophy and linguistics, particularly philosophy of language. And though I'm a professor of political history, I bring to history other disciplines, particularly discourse analysis and literary analysis. And all the books that were mentioned earlier are basically books about books. What I've done over the last 15 years is I've written a history of colonization in Southeast Asia, focusing on the production of colonial knowledge that is found in books, and how books have to be seen as tools of power. Books are never simply books, especially books during the colonial period are not simply books. These are documents of power. They are power. The ability to map you, the ability to write about you, the ability to rewrite your history is an expression of power. If I can map you, I have power over you. If I can write your history, I have power over you. And so much of this daily quotidian forms of colonial rule, I think, have been largely neglected because there are some aspects of modern life which are not somehow seen as political. So, as I've said, much of my earlier work has focused on texts and how texts construct objects. The very idea of Southeast Asia itself is a colonial construct. Southeast Asia is not an idea that is indigenous to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is part of a colonial geography, and the vocabulary of colonial geography, which has now become part and parcel of our geography. And we use the term, but we forget to interrogate its origins, and sometimes we forget that the concept of Southeast Asia itself only really emerges from the 18th century and 19th century, right? And it appears through writings. So once we accept that colonization as a phenomenon doesn't have to be studied only in terms of battles, wars, soldiers, armies, and that there are other aspects of colonial rule, then we need to understand how colonialism actually sustained itself. Simple question: how did a few thousand Dutchmen control the whole of Java and the whole of Indonesia? How did a few thousand Englishmen control the whole of India, or Burma, or Malaya? Now, I think we are all aware of the fact that Englishmen are not giants. They're not 50 feet tall. They don't breathe fire. They don't have laser coming out of their eyes. They are ordinary human beings like us. They eat, they drink, they sleep like anyone else. So how does that happen? What makes modern colonialism different from earlier forms of colonial rule and imperial rule? And I think one thing that has not been given enough emphasis is the fact that something hugely important happens at the beginning of the 17th century. And that is the birth of modern capitalism, especially with the emergence of weaponized colonial capitalism in the form of companies like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, the French Compagnie des Indes, the Spanish Compañía de las Indias Orientales. We see something new. Capital is weaponized. Capital becomes a tool of the state. And for capital to work, it needs consent. And so, something we often forget is that one of the ways through which colonialism managed to root itself in our part of the world, along with South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, was that modern colonialism, as opposed to early colonialism or late colonialism, going back to the Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire or what have you, but modern colonialism is interesting because it's driven by capital. It manifests itself in the form of companies. And what do companies do? Companies create opportunity structures. And one of the ways through which colonial rule managed to entrench itself in Asia and Africa was by offering colonized people the opportunity to take part in their own colonization. We give you a chance to be part of your own colonization. Don't forget, when you look at the history of the British Imperial Army in India, most of the soldiers were Indians. If you look at the history of the Dutch Colonial Army in Indonesia, many of the soldiers were from Indonesia. Why? Because modern colonization invites you, offers you a chance to take part in this enterprise. It's like joining an online business these days, right? And this, when we understand this, then we see that modern colonization, and by this I mean late colonial capitalism, which really takes off from the 18th century to the 19th century to the mid-20th century, this era is really interesting because this is the era that shapes the world that we live in today, where modes of coercion, dominance, control come in forms that are both violent and subtle, violent and subtle, violent and subtle. And modern colonization, because it emerges in the post-Enlightenment age, emerges at a time when the West also seeks to represent itself in terms that are civilized. Yeah, we know all empires need a justification. All empires need a justification for what they do, because there's something deeply unnatural about colonization. It is the systematic and deliberate conquest of the territory and the human capital of other societies. There's something unnatural about that. So you need something that naturalizes this, that normalizes this. And that's what I'm interested in. See, I'm not denying that there were all these wars and battles fought in Asia and Africa. Of course we know that. We know that's true. And there are many colonial military historians who've done very good work there. But how was that violence justified and normalized? That, for me, is the question. How do you normalize something abnormal? And in the process of normalizing something that is abnormal, we then talk about the maintenance of facades. All empires need a discourse of legitimation. And by the 19th century, the discourse of legitimation comes in the form of the vocabularies that many of us are familiar with now: development, modernity, progress, law and order, stability, civilization itself. So colonialism becomes part of the civilizing mission. And this rhetoric, this language, requires its material components. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the material components come in the form of books, texts, maps that I've studied. In what I've done, what I've tried to do in my latest writing, is look at another form, another medium of normalization, which are visuals. So, the book that I've been working on looks at one aspect, only one simple mundane aspect of colonial rule, which are postcards. During the colonial era, postcards were the latest, it was the most advanced, the most high-tech expression of modalities of visualization. Remember, Asians and Africans have been visualized long before. Images of Asians and Africans go all the way back to the 14th century, when Europeans began to produce woodcuts, and then prints, and then copper plates, and then lithographs, and then chromolithographs. But by the time you get to the late 19th and early 20th century, the emergence of photography provides a new medium to capture the other. If you're familiar with the ideas of Tsvetan Todorov in his book, The Conquest of America, can I just ask, how many of you here are familiar with Todorov? The Conquest of America? Has anyone? Yeah. This is a fascinating book, by the way, and maybe if you get it once, we can come back and have a discussion about it. For those of you who are interested in language and power and violence, please look for this book. I have the PDF, but it's illegal to share it with you. But the camera is on, so I cannot do anything. But it is a fascinating book. Why? Because Todorov makes a very important point. Todorov is like me. He's a historian who comes from a background of linguistics and philosophy. Todorov looks at the conquest of America, but Todorov's point is this. The conquest of America begins long before the Europeans get to America. Why? Because before getting to America, they already have an idea of what they want to find. The very act of naming America, America is the first act of violence. Because if I can name you, I have power over you. And by naming America, America, you deny the reality of native life there. You completely erase native identity, native culture, native history in the process. So this desire to capture, to know. Todorov uses a very interesting phrase, which I think would be relevant for many of you, especially for us in the domain of history. He calls it an epistemology that kills. An epistemology that kills. The desire to know the other is the desire to colonize the other. If I know you, I contain you, I control you, I define you. So knowledge, to know, to want to know, is in itself one of the primary drivers of colonization. And in the process of doing this, what happens? Knowledge comes in many forms: documentation, mapping, but also visuals. When Europeans begin to draw Asia and Africans, they're drawing themselves, because all these drawings tell us a lot about how Europeans saw Asians. If they draw us in a primitive state, it's because they see us as a primitive state. If they draw us in a backward state, it's because they see us being in a backward state. That says a lot about the viewer as it does about the object that is viewed. Now, going off from Todorov's premise, that's where my book begins. If we understand that images are never simply images, images are never simply images, that every attempt to capture visually, whether in drawing, painting, or photography, every attempt to capture a thing immediately objectifies the thing and makes the thing your thing. Then the very act of photography becomes a colonizing act. And why do I raise this? I raise this because when we today, everyday society in Southeast Asia, many ordinary Southeast Asians, when they talk about the colonial past, just now you did mention my TED talk, I raised this question: why is colonialism still romanticized? It's romanticized because there is still this perception that there is the good side of colonialism and there's the bad side of colonialism. The bad side of colonialism is that they shot a lot of people, they killed a lot of people. The good side of colonialism is, well, they taught us how to cook steaks, they taught us how to appreciate certain drinks or certain cuisines. They built some nice buildings, and these things then are presented as somehow the benign face of colonialism. I don't take that, I don't accept that. I mean, for me, the benign, so-called benign aspects of colonialism are precisely the most powerful aspects of colonialism. Why? because they are not violent, because they are pervasive. And this is where postcards come in. So all the postcards, I'll have a few postcards which I'll share with you after this. Yeah. There are a few postcards I'll show you after this. Postcard production comes to Indonesia and Malaysia quite late. It begins around the 1870s, 1880s, where people realized that you can take photos and you can turn them into cards and send them. Yeah. The history of postcards itself is actually very interesting, because today, I'm sure none of you send postcards here, because you all use WhatsApp nowadays. But my generation, generasi dan dinosaur, we used to send postcards around because you have to buy the stamp and all that. But it's actually interesting that when postcards first began, many people thought that postcards would not survive. Why? Because at the back of the postcard is open, so the postman can read what you wrote, right? So there was this idea that postcards are somehow not private. So the history of postcards itself is actually very interesting, history of postcards. So early postcards, some early postcards even came with the message already written, so that you don't have to write anything, because you don't want the postman or your neighbors to read what you wrote to your friend or whatever, right? Accidentally write "I love you" or something, and then the postman knows, oh yes, it is too, But in fact, postcards became popular, and postcards became popular very quickly, and very soon postcards became normalized. Now the interesting thing is, when we look at the history of postcards, what do postcards do? They normalize, the visualization of other cultures, other societies. When postcards first begin, postcards are a Western phenomenon. So, postcards in Germany feature buildings in Germany that are sent to people in Germany. So postcards have a national circulation. But as these Western countries become empires, they can send postcards, they can make postcards in Indonesia, in India, in Africa, in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, and send it back to London, to The Hague, to Amsterdam, to Paris, to Madrid. What does that do? That does something very interesting. If you were a British citizen in the 19th century, living in, I don't know, Manchester or Liverpool, the likelihood is you will know that you are a citizen of an empire, but you don't know what the empire looks like, because it's far away. How many British people actually got to go to India? None, right? But now India can come to you. Now India can come to you. Your Dutchman, your Dutch woman living in Utrecht or Rotterdam knows that he or she is part of an empire, and you have this empire called Indonesia, but you've never been there. But now Indonesia can come to you, and now you have proof. You have tangible proof that I belong to an empire, and this is the proof. These people, this land, this is ours. This is ours. So you see the power of postcards. When postcards become international, in a very short space of time, postcards become colonial and imperial. And what does this do? What it does is that postcards normalize empire. Normalize empire. So then getting a picture from, Calcutta in Bengal, or getting a picture from Mali, getting a picture from Senegal, becomes a normal thing, because, of course, this is part of who we were. These are our colonial possessions. They belong to us. This brings us back to Ben Anderson, right? The imagined community. At what point does a British subject, a Dutch subject, a French subject, a Spanish subject realize that he or she is an imperial colonial subject? It's when you create these bonds of association through familiarity, through visuals. But the visuals themselves are interesting because, like I said, postcards come late. So by the time we start seeing large-scale postcard production in the Dutch East Indies, in Indonesia, and in India, British Burma, British Malaya, the wars are over. The wars are over. The Javanese have been defeated, the Maduris have been defeated, the Sumatrans have been defeated, the Malays have been defeated, the Indians have been defeated, the Burmese have been defeated. So postcards are produced after the fact of conquest. And because they're produced after the fact of conquest, the postcards present to the viewer an image of a colony that has now become stable, is now peaceful, is well governed. And so in these postcards, we begin to see a very interesting process of the normalization of colonial rule, where colonial rule becomes commodified. It becomes something that you can buy and sell. For 5 cents, I can give you a bit of empire. Yeah. But when we look at the empire, what does the empire show? All these postcards, like these texts that I've studied, tell a story. They tell a story. So when I wrote about the books that were written by the British and the Dutch in the past, a book that I think many of you are familiar with. How many of you are familiar with Stanford Raffles' History of Java? Yeah, History of Java. Horrible book. And I remember once I had a PhD student said, I learned so much about Java. I said, what do you read? I said, I read Raffles' History of Java. I said, you go and unread everything you read, But the point I made is that Raffles' History of Java is an important book. It's an important book and it's an interesting book. Not because it is a history of Java, but it's a history of Britain. Because the history of Java tells us a lot about British political ambitions and economic ambitions in Java. That's what the book is really about. And this is what happens when we apply to text critical analysis, discourse analysis. We see the text, and now I'm going to do the same thing to these images. I'm going to show you some of these images here. There's what the image shows, and what the image intends to show, and what the image accidentally also shows. Yeah. So we have to learn to read images in the same way that when we look at maps, we don't look at maps. We don't look at maps. We read maps. Because maps tell us a lot, not only about the land, but they tell us a lot about the intention of the mapper, the cartographer. We learn more about what they want when they make the map than the map itself. These photos tell us a lot about how Malayans were viewed in the 19th and 20th century. So, can we start with the first image? There's no copyright problem here because all these postcards are from my collection. So I'll start with this image. This is an interesting postcard because this is actually one postcard. This is one postcard. It is the bifurcated image. There are 2 images spliced into this. It's from Penang. And remember, like I said, these postcard production begins quite late in the 19th century. By the time postcards are made, what do you need for postcards? You need stability because you need to have a postcard studio workshop. So you can't have bombs exploding. Yeah? You can't have wars. You can't have revolutions. So postcard production begins when some degree of political economic stability has already been established. And so the postcards are actually interesting because they come at the time when colonial rule is consolidated. It's consolidated. So we start with this postcard. I find this postcard very interesting because this postcard, this one simple postcard, tells you so much. It's one postcard, yeah, like I said, these 2 images are actually on one card, and it's from Penang. But you see above Penang Municipal Office, the British Municipal Office, and below Penang Malay Village. Now, you don't have to be a genius to see that something is being said in this postcard. This contrast between the British colonial building and the Malay village is one which in so many ways corresponds to and reinforces all these Enlightenment prejudices that I've talked about. The idea of civilization and the uncivilized, the civilized and the uncivilized, the developed and the non-developed, underdeveloped, those who cannot develop, the idea of progress and backwardness, all encapsulated in this and in concrete form. And in fact, it's literally interesting because the one above is concrete, the one below is wood. Right? So we have then a statement. This postcard is telling us something. It's speaking to us. It's saying, look at what we've done. Look at what we've done. Look at what we've built. Yeah. And look at what they have and what they built. Remember, these postcards have a specific audience. Are these postcards made for the colonized subjects? No, they're made for the imperial subjects back in Europe because they get sent back. They get sent back all the time. These postcards, by the way, in the past would be sold in train stations, at ports, because they become souvenirs and people collect them and send them back to their friends. Okay, we go to next image. This is also from Penang, and this for me is a very interesting one. I noticed one thing. I have a huge collection of postcards, a few hundred postcards in fact, right? So when I looked at postcards of Penang, of Ipoh, of Kuala Lumpur, of Singapore, many of these postcards, tend to focus on colonial buildings because they are produced by colonial photographers. For some reason, clock towers often appear. I have a few. There's one from Singapore as well, you see a clock tower. One from Kuala Lumpur, you see a clock tower. This one from Penang, you see a clock tower. Now, today, of course, we might wonder, okay, what's so interesting about a stupid clock tower? It's a clock tower. Nowadays, you look at your phone, right? What's important? But again, in the same way that you read a painting in context, you read a book in context, you read these photographs in context. Why are clock towers important? Because there are many other narratives that run parallel to the narrative of empire. Like I said, imperialism needs to normalize itself. It always needs to normalize itself. And a common theme in British, Dutch, Spanish, French colonial discourse at the time was that Asians are never on time. Asians cannot come on time. You say 2 o'clock, they come at 5 o'clock. Asians are slow. Asians cannot work, they cannot follow schedules. So that's why we have to come. We colonize you because you don't have time. You have no sense of time. In fact, for those of you who are interested in this, one of the fathers of Orientalist discourse in Southeast Asia is William Marsden. William Marsden wrote a very interesting essay called "On the Chronology of the Hindus Among the Siamese," and basically what the essay is about is basically saying that Siamese, Thai people, have no idea of time until the Indians brought time. So before that, Thais had no time. I don't know what they were doing, but they had no time. So the idea that was common at the time was that non-Western societies do not understand temporality, do not understand time. What is time? Time is regulation. Time is control. Time is schedules. Trains run on time. Businesses run on time. Ships run on time. Today, planes run on time. Classes run on time. Time, the control time, chronology, is a very important theme which runs through so much of the colonial enterprise. But again, like I said, we don't pay attention to it. Why? Because it's not glamorous. No soldiers cannot go on Netflix, right? So, but time is such an important thing. To control time. And what does the clock tower do? It imposes time. That's like the Eye of Sauron. It's imposing time on you. It's telling you this is the time to work. Right? So the recurring image of clock towers in so many of these colonial postcards, for me, is a subject in itself. Okay, now can we go to the next one? But of course, what's driving this? So this is what's driving this: capital. Capital. Why do you need schedules? Why? Because you have a port. Why do you have a port? Because you want to trade. What are you trading? You're trading colonial goods. What are the colonial goods? These are goods that have been stolen. So basically, it's a legalization of colonial theft, but it comes through a form of enterprise. And of course, this is the language of modern colonialism. It's not like the Roman Empire. Why do we conquer Germany? Because we just want you guys to speak Latin. No. Why are we here? We're here because we've brought something. We've brought commerce and trade, and with that, modernity and development and progress. And it is expressed in concrete terms, in terms of these monuments. And these are monuments of economic power. And so when we look at these images, when we look at these postcards today, don't forget, that's what these things are. That's what these buildings represent. It's not an accident that these monuments are huge. If you look at the Dutch edifice built right in front of the Kraton in Jogja, that's a statement. That's a statement. Why was it built there? It's built there to demonstrate that Dutch economic colonial power is now stronger than indigenous Japanese power, and we build it in front like a block, like a wall, bending, to block your power. These monuments, which today, of course, are celebrated because they look pretty and they end up in so many local dramas and all that, they all have a history. They bring a narrative, a story with them. Next one. And again, images of colonial economy and work. Next one. Contrasted to native economy. And native economy, and this is where we begin to see the exoticization of Southeast Asians. In many of the postcards that we produce in British India, British Burma, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, this recurring image of native industry, native dwellings, native habitations, native towns would often focus on what we now call traditional architecture like this. But the contrast, remember these postcards are sold in sets, so you buy and you can see the contrast. This is what we built, this is what they built. And you can see the contrast. And this sets the tone for then the depiction of the natives themselves. Colonial postcards in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, are very interesting because they tend to fall into two categories. One, architecture, like this, buildings, and two, people. So, next one. And then we start seeing the objectification of the Southeast Asian. Right? And these are some interesting figure studies from Singapore. Can you go to the next one? I like this one. Okay. Malay medical man, Dr. Melayu, right? And the beginnings of the orientalization and the exoticization of the Asian. But this is not really something new, because this is an idea that goes back 500 years. But now it has been captured in photographic form. It becomes real, because you can see, right? Like today, right? You see, I went to the restaurant. Your friends won't believe unless you put it on TikTok, right? So the visual depiction, the visual capture of the Malay medical man. This postcard for me is a very powerful one. It's a very powerful one because of not only the image, but also the label that comes with it. By labeling a Malay medical man, you are saying so many things at the same time. You're saying basically like, this is the state of native medicine. We build hospitals. They go to Dukun and Bom. Right? We bring modern medication. They believe in jamu and traditional cures. Of course, now today jamu has become famous because some celebrities put it on TikTok. But in the 19th century, all of this is again always cast. So we see in these postcards, you can see it yourself, right? There are two registers at work. There is the advanced, civilized, modern, and then there is the backward, uncivilized, pre-modern, or even anti-modern. The next one. This is also an interesting one. The Malay postman. Remember what I said earlier. Yeah. How does colonialism entrench itself? It doesn't entrench itself only through soldiers and armies and fortresses and military camps. It really entrenches itself when colonialism becomes part and parcel of your daily life. And the image of the Malay postman is also an interesting one, because this is the colonized subject that has now been brought into the structure of empire. Because he is now a native subject that serves the empire. He's a postman working for the British Postal Service. Now if you look at this one, go back. Okay, this one, back and back. Okay, go forward again. Notice one thing, next one, and last one. Okay, this is a Malay shop and a Malay salesman. Something you see in common in all of these native postcards is that none of them are wearing shoes. None of them are wearing shoes. I find these postcards interesting because in so many ways they repeat. They're very repetitive. All these postcards are very repetitive. They repeat the same thing, the same image, the same idea. Yeah? But these are simple, small ideas, but when you repeat them again and again, they have a cumulative effect. And the constant recurring image of the native, whether it's the Javanese or the Sumatran or the Malay or the Dayak or whatever, without shoes, for example, sometimes without shirts. Remember, one of the ways in which the non-Western other was seen at the time was defined was in terms of lack of, without clothes, without shoes. And that the lack of clothes, the lack of shoes denotes something missing. And what's missing is modernity in progress. So these postcards for me, today, of course, people say, oh, they're very charming, they're very quaint, but you set them in the context of the 19th century and the 20th century, early 20th century, they're powerful. They are powerful because when these images go back to London and Manchester and Leeds and Edinburgh and Liverpool or Paris or Madrid or Lisbon, the idea of the backward native other becomes part of the common currency of images in the Western world. And this then, is how these 17th, 18th, 19th century Orientalist stereotypes get reproduced in the 19th century and the 20th century. Same trope, same idea, except now in new packaging. Yeah? From drawings to woodcuts to lithographs and now photography. So why is this important? I mean, why should I write about these images from the 19th century? I write about these images from the 19th century because, like I said at the beginning, I think one difficult truth that many of us in post-colonial Asia and Africa still cannot accept is the idea that the post-colonial state, whether we like it or not, is actually built on the foundations of the colony. And this is seen in the way in which many post-colonial states still operate according to the very familiar logic, very similar logic that drove the creation of modern colonies in Asia and Africa in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Simple example, our concept of development, pembangunan, development. This idea of development that we have today is an idea that goes back to the 19th century. Because we have one understanding of development, only one, which is development has to be driven by capital. I mean, we talk about Asian values, we talk about other holistic forms of development, but come on, it doesn't really happen, right? I mean, it doesn't really happen. In the end, it's how much kelapa sawit we have, right? That's what's important, right? How much rubber we produce, how many cars we produce, how many fridges we produce. Our very understanding of development goes back to the 19th century, whether we like it or not. And it's also captured in these images that we see earlier. Yeah? These images of commerce industry progress, commerce industry progress. So our understanding of progress, whether we like it or not, has been shaped by not only the ideas but also the visuals of the 19th century. But another reason why I think visuals in particular deserve special attention is because visuals in themselves represent a distinct domain of human activity that needs to be understood. Why are these visuals important? Because when you look at how we today, Southeast Asians, visualize ourselves, more often than not, how do we understand ourselves? How do we see ourselves? We see ourselves often in 19th century terms. I'll give you a very simple example. I'm sure many of you have been invited to official events or weddings, maybe not divorces, but weddings. And you notice on the wedding card, it might say, dress, traditional dress. And this is very common in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Philippines, in Thailand. You get an invitation that says traditional dress. Intuitively, automatically, what do we understand when we say traditional dress? It's 19th century dress. It's 19th century dress. So if you want to wear your pakaian adat, baju adat, Minang or Java or whatever, it's the way it was fixed in the 19th century. You don't go dress as an 8th century man from Majapahit, right? You don't. Right? You don't. You don't go dress like a 10th century man from Ayodhya. You don't. You dress as a 19th century Javanese. You dress as a 19th century Malay. You dress as a 19th century Malaysian. Why? Because the 19th century is the century that freezes. Because of the power of the visuals of empire. Somehow in the 19th century, something very interesting happened, not only to us, but across Asia and across Africa. Why? Because it's at the 19th century that all these technologies culminated to reach their peak at the same time. weapons technology, logistics technology, economic, logistics, transportation and movement, photography, cartography, postcard production, all of them reached their peak at the same time. And when all these technologies peaked at the same time, the combined use of all of them was so powerful that it left a lasting impact on us until today. And that's why, again, like I said, when we think of traditional dress, it's 19th century dress. Another example. Look at how we see ourselves and how we project ourselves to the world, right? Because Southeast Asia is very popular for tourism, and all Southeast Asian countries have their tourist campaigns. My book ends, the last chapter actually looks at tourism campaigns. Just watch all the tourist ads that are produced on TV or on YouTube, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from Philippines, or even India, China. All the tourist ads repeat all these images that we see. And so when we look at Southeast Asia, any Southeast Asian country, what are we likely to find? All of the ads are always the same. We have beaches, jungles, durian, kelapa, orangutan. Orangutan doesn't get paid. And then you have the natives, us. And we do native things. Sepak takraw, silat, and all that stuff. All these things. Why? Because that's how we see ourselves. We never show ourselves as scientists. We never show ourselves as merchants. That other aspect of our history that was completely wiped out through these images. Because what these images do is they deny the pre-existing history of transnational, inter-regional commerce that was prevalent in Southeast Asia. So these, like I said, images project one thing, but as they project one thing, they also push to the background other things. Images are very powerful in that respect because you can only focus on one thing. If you focus on the image of the primitive native, that native's culture, history, economy, all of that gets relegated to the background. We do the same today, even in the way that we project ourselves. So while we complain, and this is common in Southeast Asia, we complain about Orientalism. Who is Orientalizing us now? We are. Asians are very good at self-exoticization. It's our hobby, it is our skill. And we are so good at self-exoticization that we turn it into products for TikTok among ourselves. It has become part of the way we have commodified our identities. And this commodification of identities, this commodification of culture, this commodification of history, the commodification of ourselves, as a people with a culture, with a history, with a language of our own, that for me is just the latest episode in the long history of modern colonialism that started 300 years ago with the advent of these modern colonial companies. And so this brings me to my last question, which is the question of this talk. Was colonial photography innocent? And this is a question which I think is difficult for me to answer myself. The people who made these postcards, many of the postcards are anonymous. We don't know. You don't have the name of the maker. But there were some prominent ones. A. Kalfas, for example, was based in Penang. And then you have some, there was one company, the Continental Stamp Company, based in Singapore. They were producing these postcards. Now, here's the tricky question. I think these postcards perpetuate and reproduce all the colonial Orientalist stereotypes that had been around for 200 years before. So in that sense, these are colonial Orientalist postcards. But are the images themselves, and is photography itself, innocent? Now, it's hard to answer that question because one, many of these photographers were just merchants. They were just selling things. It's like today someone selling T-shirts. I just sell T-shirts. To what extent they believed in the propaganda of empire is something that's very hard for historians to ascertain because we don't have their biographies. We don't know much about them. But it is quite likely that at that time they just produced what was popular. because many of these postcards, and in the beginning of my book, there's a long chapter where I talk about the lack of originality of these postcards. These postcards where you see the jungle, the kampung. There's a long history of this. There's 300, 400-year history of depicting Asia and Asians as villagers, as rural people. Postcards simply used the same idea, but commodified it and disseminated it even wider because of the technology of postcards at the time. So the question is, can we say that the photographers were guilty? I don't know. I can't answer that question. But were the circumstances of colonial postcard production innocent? And there, I think, we can have an answer. We can answer. My argument, my contention is that even though the photographers themselves may or may not have been deliberately, consciously advocating empire, they worked under conditions of empire. They were fully aware of the fact that all of this production, and this is commodity, you're making money out of this. You could make money out of empire. You could make money under the conditions of empire. And if you can make money under the conditions of empire, then empire itself is something that has to be interrogated. And so, to conclude, when we look at these postcards today, and in some parts of Southeast Asia, some of these colonial images that I showed you, because people don't know their context. I've seen them turn into t-shirts and stuff. So people walk around with t-shirt images of these postcards, not understanding the colonial context from which they emerged. But that colonial context, I think, is the thing that we need to study. For me, the production of postcards is no different from the production of commodities. Whether it's rice or tin or rubber, it's the same. It happens under the auspices of empire. The thing about postcards, the thing about images, because they can be commodified, is they often escape our attention because they look innocent, because they look like something popular. This is pop culture. This is TikTok before TikTok. This is Instagram before Instagram. Yeah. So this is pop culture. This is pop culture. You send it. You send it to your friends as something you share, but you're sharing it during the time of empire. And whether you like it or not, the circumstances of their production, which is imperialism, were not innocent. So I think this is something important, especially for us historians, for those of you who work on history of power, history of domination, conquest, colonialism. This, I think, is something that we need to bear in mind in our analysis. Yeah? Because I don't think it's the historian's job to say, this guy is innocent, this guy is guilty, this guy is good, this guy is bad. That's not my job, and I don't think it's any historian's job. But I think we as historians need to always understand that anything we study, whether it's sport or popular culture or fiction or movies or whatever, has to be studied under the context, within the context of the political economy of the time. And the political economy of the time was the age of empire. So, are the postcards innocent? Are the postcard makers innocent? I cannot answer. But what I will conclude with is that these are documents of empire. These are documents of power. In the same way that colonial maps are not simply maps, and colonial writings are not simply writings, and colonial fiction is not simply fiction, colonial photography and colonial postcards are not simply photographs and postcards. There's something much more. They are things that are deeply embedded in the uneven, unequal power relations of that time. And in so many ways, the uneven power relations of the time are evident in the postcards themselves. So I hope that for those of you who are in the domain of history, like me, we need to widen the scope of our research. There's a tendency for many historians and scholars to focus primarily on books. There's a very good book recently, by the way, by Sandeep Ray about the colonial cinema in Dutch Indonesia. And the great thing about Sandeep Ray's book is that he makes a good argument that we always study text, yeah? I mean, your professors ask you to go to the archive all the time. The point he makes is that the movies that were made by the Dutch are also texts. You can also study these movies as texts. And the point I'm making is somewhat similar. These postcards are texts. We we can study, and we should start studying not only postcards but also colonial advertising, colonial tourism images. All these things are valid objects of study, and for us as historians, it basically expands our domain of research even wider, which means that we have even more work to do, and you don't have to retire. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Farish, for very fascinating lectures. I think there are many powerful statements that we actually made throughout this lecture. But before I open up the question to the floor, I have some question actually lingering around my head while I was listening to you. Is that who this poster actually made for? So when the display is displaying about the native, or the colonized landscape, or the colonized subject, and so who are these actually this picture were made for? So I think that's also an important question, whether these actually made for the native, or it is actually made for the audience of the empire, the colonizers. Farish were mentioning about that this postcard actually went to Europe, all over Europe, to display about the colonized countries in Southeast Asia. So I think that's also something that we can wonder about. And then the entanglement that these pictures or postcards had between the colonizers and the colonized subject in Southeast Asia, be it in Malaya, British Malaya, or in Dutch Indies or Indonesia during the 19th century or 20th century. We can see, if we are looking at the work on photography in Indonesia, the history of photography in Indonesia, which occurred in late 19th century, we can see there were abundance of pictures made by the end of the 19th centuries, and we can also see, also can question about the power relation that occurs out of this picture produced in Dutch Indies or India at the time. They were sent, for example, to the the Queen of Wilhelmina, displaying about how the people of Indonesia in 19th century live, or the landscape of the Indonesia in the 19th century. What does this actually try to convey, to the metropole or to the Western country? So, but I will stop here, and then I will give the opportunity for discussion to all of you. So I would like to open it up with 3 questions. And we have full audience here, so really great. Yeah. Maybe next time when we have your book launch here, so I'm proposing we can reserve for a bigger room. Yeah. All right. Please, if you have someone would like to open with, or to start with a question or comment. Oh yeah. Okay. We have Mas Wildan, and then can someone help me with the microphone? Yeah. Okay. So we have Mas Wildan, and next to Mas Wildan and Mbak with the maroon here.
Thank you, Farish, for your enlightening lecture. And it's my question is a simple one, but it's difficult for me actually. So, is there any indigenous or local native photographer from the Colonial Malaya? That's one question. And if there's any, how the local or the pribumi projecting their visual of the land? I have assumptions, if there's any, perhaps they will work to the empire, or they work under the auspices of empire. But I'm curious with the British Colonial Malaya, because the context of Netherlands Indie. I also curious, is there any local or a pribumi photographer who visual their land? That's my question.
Thank you, Professor Farish. I'm Nazif from the Department of the History. During your presentation, I was wondering that you just presented something that really subtle, like very smooth, that might, for someone who are, let's say, very usual to like data statistics and so on. This is something that really not really appreciated. For example, I have one occasions that I try to talk to someone, let's say have something very important positions, that what you do is just the continuations of the post-colonialism. And then he replied that no, this is not related at all to colonialism. But the idea of self-understanding, identity, this is something that really subtle, that something that maybe people who think development or something like that is not really pay attention at. And do you have any suggestions or how to make this kind of discussion engage with the further debates like in 2 days? Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Haya. I have a question. Do you use framing analysis to this study? And if you have used framing analysis, how you framing the structure of the postcard production? You analyze the photographer, the company of postcard production. Thank you.
I'll try to give quick answers. Question about framing analysis. I do. I'm not saying that framing analysis is not valid. Yeah, but remember, all I'm trying to do in the book that I wrote was to give these postcards context. So, for example, like just now, remember the image of the clock tower, right? So, what I try to do is I try to explain why the clock tower is important at that time. Because I'm trying to locate these images in context. And again, the image of the medicine man. Why is the image of the medicine man the way it is? What's important? What does it say? You can only understand that when you study these postcards in the context of other studies, other historical studies about, say, the state of colonial medicine. Okay? And so then once you know the claims that were made, the dominant narrative about Western medicine in Asia and Africa at the time, then you understand why that postcard of the medicine man has a meaning of its own. Yeah? Because all you see is a man. Yeah? The postcard doesn't say anything to you. It doesn't come with any text that says this is a primitive doctor who doesn't understand modern medicine. It doesn't say that. Right? But for you to understand that, you have to understand the context behind it. So that's what I do. So I take the point about framing analysis, but that's not my intention. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to place these images in context as texts that can be read. The question about native photographers. They were in fact some, yeah. But likewise, they tended to also produce the same things. And this goes back to the earlier question, who are these postcards for, right? So they were, even in Indonesia, Solo, for example, had a few photographers. Jogja also had a few photographers, native photographers, both either Pribumi or Chinese in Solo and in Jogja. But what were they doing? They were producing the same kind of images. Because why? Who buys them? Tourists buy them. Westerners buy them to take them back. So you produce what people want to buy. And who's your clientele? So there's a whole political economy behind this. So even when you have local photographers, and postcard production slowly begins, like the printing press slowly begins, they target the audiences. So, to the question, who are these postcards for? You can go back to Raffles' book, The History of Java. I think it's safe to assume that when Raffles wrote The History of Java, it was not written for the Javanese. Yeah? It's written for his fellow Englishmen. That's why for me, The History of Java is the history of England. That's what the book is about. It's basically a book that tells
the story of how and why Britain came to occupy Java for 6 years, and why British occupation is better than Dutch occupation. This is not a book that's meant to be read by Javanese. In fact, I think Raffles never imagined that one day Javanese would read his book. That's why he says so many nasty things about Javanese in the book. 200 years later, he's rolling in his grave at the moment because so many Indonesian historians are now criticizing his book, something which he never imagined could happen. So likewise, I think the postcards are meant. And by the way, where do we find these postcards? They're all in Europe. Yeah? My whole collection was built from the time I worked in Europe, because all these postcards end up in Europe. It's very hard to find these postcards in our part of the world. They all get sent back. And that in itself is also an interesting story, yeah? Because Dutch postcards, Indonesian postcards go to Holland. Malayan postcards, Burmese postcards, Indian postcards, Pakistani, Bangladeshi postcards, they go back to England. So even the movement of the postcards correspond to the movement of commodities and capital. They go back to the metropole, So it's actually an interesting study. We have to study the capillaries of contact. I want to get to your question, which I find a very interesting question. How do you deal with someone, a lay person, yeah, who may or may not be consciously or unconsciously reproducing the modalities or the stereotypes or the cliches of empire? First thing, history is not psychology. Yeah? We do not treat orang bodoh. Yeah? That's not our job. Yeah? That's not our job. Secondly, what makes you think they need to be treated in the first place? Because I hear this many times, yeah? And it's a common thing even among historians. Yeah? Remember, many historians say this: if you don't learn history, you will repeat the mistakes of history. That's actually a very bad way of selling history as a subject. It's as if what? If you read history, I will become a wise man. I will not kill people. I'm sorry, if you want to kill people, read history. Because history teaches you how to build empires, build colonies, massacre people, bomb countries. History is full of examples of how to be dictatorships, authoritarian leaders, empire builders. History is full of that. So history is not a panacea. History is not a panacea. It's not a magic pill. You read critical history and then suddenly you become a book, and it doesn't happen. I hope not, because that's not the job of history. For me, the point I make about many people in the post-colonial world repeating the modalities and the mindsets and the vocabularies of empire is an accurate depiction of reality today, because time is not episodic. Yeah, that's why I don't like using phrases like pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. Then time becomes like episodes of Game of Thrones, episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. But it's not. Time is continuous. It's continuous. It's contiguous and it overlaps. And so there are so many elements that seep back and forth. And because if you see time in episodic terms, then you're committed to a linear conception of time. Time moves one way, unidirectional. But it doesn't, yeah, because we see this, yeah, we revert back and forth all the time. So, and I deal with this, like I said, I have a constant problem when I look at our tourism ads. Why are we exoticizing ourselves all the time? We seem to want to exoticize ourselves all the time. We understand the political and economic intention. We want to sell something to tourists. We want tourists to come because we want money. We want money. What do we give? We give exoticism. We give bananas, orangutan, beaches. We give our exotic self to earn cash. That's a straightforward commercial exchange. Yeah. But in the process of doing that, of course, we repeat these stereotypes. We cliche ourselves. We turn ourselves into stereotypes ourselves, right? Now, I think we are still at that juncture because we never left the 19th century. For me, we are living in the 19th century. We are living in the 19th century. We've never left the 19th century because our geography, our political geography is 19th century. Our political vocabulary is 19th century. Our understanding of our identities, especially national identities, are 19th century. So we've not made that leap yet. We've not made that leap yet. We are moving away from it, but we are still in, the long shadow of the 19th century. And so because of that, these people that you meet, I think, are historically genuine today. Yeah, and it's not a problem here. I've seen it everywhere across Asia and in Africa as well. I've seen the same thing happening. So this tells us something about our stage of development. What's our job as historians? Not to correct the problem, because we're not psychiatrists. We don't say, okay, now lie down and tell me your problems and I will correct it for you. It's not going to happen. That's not our job. Yeah, our job is to actually record this. Record this. In the same way that when we look at the early encounters, the early encounters, 17th, 18th century, when the Europeans first begin to come to Southeast Asia, we also see this early adaptation where we begin to adapt to Western culture, Western norms, Western beliefs, and so our identities are fluid over time. And I think that's what we ought to be doing. It's interesting to talk to these people. It's interesting. I'll give you an example. You gave an example. I was telling Yuri this example. I was doing a documentary in East Malaysia, and I wanted to talk to some people from the local Pribumi community. I said, the documentary was supposed to be critical about colonial stereotypes of the exotic Asians. So I spoke to some of these community leaders before the interview, and I said, for 200 years, your community, your people have been cast as savage, violent, exotic, and I want to talk about this, and then they say, yes, it's true, we are savage, we are violent, we are exotic, and they're very proud of it because a lot of tourists come to take photos, right? So, and I couldn't do the interview because I thought, oh my God, this is going to be counterproductive. But at the same time, that's accurate because that is the reality today. Yeah, we can complain about exoticism and we can complain about neo-colonial stereotypes, but let's face it, neo-colonial stereotypes sell. Yeah. Orientalist cliches sell, and all these tourists who come to Indonesia, they're not coming to ATM, they're going to the beach, they're going to Bali, so there's a reason for that, and that tells us a lot about the power relations in the world today, the power differentials in the world today. So that's what we study. I think that's what we can map out. So even to study people like this is in itself an interesting thing, to understand our state of mind now, because a lot of history is actually now, and we are recording the thing now for future research and future reference. So, but thanks for the question, because it is something that we encounter all the time.
You can have that. Okay, I would like to invite more questions from you. Okay, I will take one from there, and then one from the back, and then you, and then we can go one second. Yeah, Rizky, can you help the microphone please to...
Thank you for the opportunity. I don't know if my response will be called a question, more like a comment. And it's quite related to the first questions about the indigenous or local photographer. In Jogja, Mr. Farish A Noor, the Kraton of Jakarta had his own court photographer. Kasian Chapas is indigenous. I think he's a Catholic. And remains of his home can be still found in the near Malaya. And I think what you present, like the modern imperialism or colonialism, is driven by capitalists. Exactly what Jeffas do in his work, in his photography, because he was asked to capture many photos, hundreds of photos around Jogja. For trinkets, for the Dutch elites who come here for tourism, and they want to go back. So they must have some trinkets, of course, artifact. And Sheva's photo is one of them. And you can still access a lot of it in the Wikimedia. All has been uploaded there by the Wikimedians. And that's what you say is what's exactly happening here, and it's still going on until today. If you visit Pasar Kangen, it's a local event. Every annually there's this event called Pasar Kangen, and you can still found some of his photo still being sold until today because, well, many merchants found that they can make money from these colonial photos besides selling photo of idol group, of course. So I think it's still happening until today, and it's true what you talked about. We're still exercising ourselves, orientalizing ourselves, because I also go to the event to search for second book or colonial archive, so I can use it. And lots of people are still buying it. Whether she's a college student, she's just ordinary high school students, parents, sometimes for trinkets. Sometimes these students came from outside of Java, and then they go to this event, they buy it, so they can show it to their parents, to their family, to their friends back in their home. So, if I'm not mistaken, in the first part you say that many people think postcard will be gone, but even today we still reproduce it. These merchants sometimes don't care about copyright. They just found it online, they just print it and print it and print again, so they can still make money. And that is a very interesting case that happened in here. I don't found in my town in Bekasi. I think it's very interesting, of course, and maybe you can came there by yourself and see by yourself. Maybe you can buy it because it really captures what you say, that one of the aspects of colonial rules is development, and that's the thing that many people in Indonesia today doesn't see it. We still, I don't know, maybe think it's very important, developmental things, even until today. And sometimes even in here, the people who learn about history in the college, in university, are also reproducing it. Whether it's because that's the only way for them to make money, or just they don't know it as part of a colonial thing. Yeah, maybe that's all I can say. I will invite you to come to the Pasar Kangen itself and see by yourself that it's still being reproduced. Even when all the Dutch population, Dutch soldier in here are already gone, it's only their forts left. It's still happening. It's not disappearing. It's not gonna end soon, and I think it will still gonna happen for the future, for a couple of years from now. I think that's all my comment. Thank you.
Okay, can we go to the next question, please? Over there.
Allow me to introduce myself first. I'm Jarvis. I'm a student of history in Universitas Gajah Mada, or Gajah Mada University. I've been a research student here, so I've been here since 2024. I have a question for you, Mr. Farish. The discussion about the topic is about colonial photography and postcards, right? And then, as you said before, many native photographers, like Kasya and Kevin, as mentioned, according to your explanation, they are just reproducing the same things that European photographers have done before. So even though they're from they're native photographers, they're still reproducing the same thing because they're targeting the same market. I want to ask you, and also explain an interesting case of Raden Saleh. So Raden Saleh was known as the first native painter from Java especially, and he was actually the first painter to paint in the European style, especially Romanticism. And one of his famous paintings is about the capture of the Prince Diponegoro, Pangeran Diponegoro. Now this painting was always hailed here as some sort of nationalist version that contradicts Pienaman's version of the capture of Diponegoro, which according to many people depicts Diponegoro in the sense that he was humiliated, whereas Raden Saleh's version was described as showing him as glorious, defiant, a prince who would never surrender, but eventually surrendered due to circumstances and because he was forced. But then again, after listening to your explanation, I want to ask the question. So is it true that the narration or the popular theme around Raden Saleh that people say he's painting Prince Diponegoro in the quote-unquote nationalistic side that wants to depict him as glorious Japanese prince that is defiant? Is it true that it was like that? Or is it also the case that, in the case of Raden Saleh, is it also that he was just reproducing the same thing like as other Europeans do? Because at the time, of course, his paintings were targeted for European nobles and of course for European elite audience and not the natives themselves who probably only seen them recently. So that is my question, and thank you.
Okay, and then we go to
Good morning. My name is Rumi. First, I want to say I'm very appreciating this lecture, your lecture, sir, because it's very insightful. I'm really waiting for the book. So I think it's not a question, but more personal mumbling. But I think it's interesting because I think the curse from colonial era, we never escape from its oxymoron effect. I say that because I'm very aware how about the postcard from colonial era showing the natives with traditional clothes and maybe they want the Western public want to see some very exotic, very beautiful from farmland era and etc. etc. But I also aware for them maybe it's exotic, but for the local natives it's everyday clothes. Maybe it's different by social class, by feudalism, but it's another story. But for the local natives is just everyday clothes. And what I want to say about this is oxymoron effect. Colonial photography can be very important archive for immortalize traditional clothes, traditional craftsmanship, traditional jewelry, because I know some kampung, some village in Minangkabau who very famous for its songket, its traditional and another traditional jewelry, and now they are forgot to create it. But when one of my friend showed them the old photograph, they suddenly, I think I can still make like this. They are forgot, but when they see the colonial archive, suddenly I think I can try to remember to create these clothes. So it's one of the oxymoron effect from colonial era. And another oxymoron effect, when you come to go to big cities in Indonesia like Jakarta, you will see many young people it's trend now to wearing traditional clothes, traditional batik, traditional songket. They aware colonial times bring us as a local to somehow shameful about traditional clothes. We know the first president of Indonesia, Soekarno, when he's still young and married with his first wife, Utari, he have this grandpa with penghulu for the wedding, because the penghulu, if you using Western clothes, this is the kafir clothes. I don't want to marrying you, the ulama, the penghulu say, but Soekarno says this is progressive clothes. This is modern clothes. if you don't want me to wearing these clothes, I prefer not to wear utari. He said that in the so this is a very difficult because when we say in modern times, why we don't embrace our traditional clothes? Why we don't embrace our songket and sarung? Why we must shameful because Western idea in Victorian and Edwardian era say this is the primitive clothes. I think it's very difficult when we say oxymoron effect. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much.
Let's go back to this idea of how you read these images. The picture of a banana is just a banana, right? Nothing special about it. It's just a fruit. But when that photograph is put in a certain context, then that fruit can become either strange or exotic or expensive or whatever. There was, for instance, in Japan at one point a craze. Bananas were regarded as very expensive fruit. Yeah, and many people did not realize this. So in Japan, at one point in its modern history, there were special banana restaurants because bananas were seen like really expensive because they had to be imported. They're not indigenous. So that in one part of the world, bananas are exotic. In another part of the world, bananas are luxurious. So it's all again a question of perspective. And I think here you're right. Of course, these photographs in themselves, in what they contain, they do tell us how people dress, right? But the point you made is important. They were dressing that way because that's what they had in their cupboard anyway, right? So if in the 19th century we had jeans in our cupboard, that would end up in the postcards. Today our traditional dress would be jeans, you see this weird historical loop that happens. This is mundane. What we see is mundane, it's ordinary. This is how ordinary Javanese, Malays, Sumatrans, Maduris dressed at the time. But when you photograph it under this context of a colonial power, then I think something else happens to it. Because here we go back to the transmission, when these images then are brought back to a Western world that regards itself as superior and civilized and modern, automatically a thing becomes exotic. Automatically it has to be defined through the perspective. And so that's why I think the study of images is interesting, because here is where you see that intertextuality, and how there's no one correct way to read these images. And all I'm trying to do is I'm trying to set them in a broader context, like explaining why clock towers are important when we understand a colonial conception of time, or why an image of a native medical man becomes something else when we understand a Western understanding of modern medicine that was imposed in the colonies. But of course, until today, they are also, because they're photographs and not drawings, they're also far more accurate. So like you said, it's true, restoration of buildings, fabrics, material culture, photographs are hugely important because that's where we actually see what the batik looks like, what the soket looks like, and what have you. So I've got no problems with that. But I'm just saying that's a contemporary usage. Yeah? That's us today reading this. That's us today reading this. Now, in the 19th century, it may have been read differently. So this is the problem, when we do our work as historians, we're trying to place ourselves in the context of the audiences at the time. How would this have been read? To go back to the earlier questions, both questions in fact, just now was mentioned about these images. In fact, if you go down Malioboro, some of the shops in Malioboro even sell T-shirts with images of the Javanese from Raffles' History of Java. Yeah? And these are the images done by Daniels. Now, the interesting thing about these images by Daniels, some of you I think are familiar with what I'm talking about, the famous color plates from Raffles' History of Java. They were done by the illustrator Daniels. Now, think about it. These plates were done and
published in 1817. 1817. 5 years before that, Jogja was bombed by the British. The invasion of Jogja happened in 1812. Throughout the book, there is no mention of the violence that took place. Not during the landing in Batavia, not at the fighting that goes all the way to Windsor, and certainly not the attack on Yogyakarta. No mention. So these images that were done by Daniels then presents the idea of an idyllic, pacified, that's the key word, safe Java with safe Javanese that are now presented. Now, if you know Daniels' work, and I've got a few other plates. I have all the plates from Raffles, but I also have Daniel's plates from other works. What's interesting is that the plates of the Javanese in Daniel's work, are presented almost like biological studies. They're all like that. What does a Javanese man look like? Like that, right? But in the other plates that Daniels does for other books, they are more alive. You see people talking, eating, smoking, gambling, playing dice, catching fish. So why is it that these images for Raffles are presented the way they are? Why is it that in the history of Java, the book, The History of Java, the Javanese are presented in almost this robotic way, static? And what's being captured there is also class, because if you look at the Daniels images, you have the upper class Javanese, the middle class Javanese, and the lower class Javanese, or also one Maduris there as well. So there is an attempt, these images are actually mapping. It's social class mapping. It's the mapping of social class through visuals. Again, that's also accurate. Again, that's accurate, right? But again, it also depends on the perspective of the person viewing it, because this book, these images are not made for Javanese, they're made for Europeans back home. So that's why we're always caught in this trap, and that's why when we do analysis of historical documents, historical records, archive records, all these Dutch archive records were not written for you, not written for me. It's written to be read by someone in The Hague or Rotterdam or Utrecht, right? I mean, it goes back there. Now, when we do our interpretation today, the difficulty for us, the challenge we face, is trying to put ourselves in a similar context to understand what was being communicated at the time. One last point, this is not related to what we discussed. I mean, today, there were many other images that I talked about here, but something I find very interesting are the postcards of women. I didn't show any of the postcards of women here, but the British and the Dutch and the French, of course, loved taking postcards of Asian and African women. There are two outstanding features of the postcards of women compared to men. We do there you see one, there's a Javanese woman there. You see a Malay street boy, you see a Malay medical man, you see a Malay postman. What they have in common is, one, they don't wear shoes, but the other thing is, you know what their jobs are. One is a doctor, a medical man, one is a street boy, one is a postman. So men in these postcards have a occupational function and economic purpose. Now you compare that to the postcards of women, and I have a lot of these postcards of women, it will always say the same thing. Malay woman, Malay girl. Javanese woman, Javanese girl. So basically, women had no jobs. And if women have no jobs, women are economically useless. And if women are economically useless, then the only function women have is to be commodified. That's actually very interesting. There are almost no postcards I have. I have one or two that will say Malay dancer. So at least then we know what she was doing. She was a dancer. But in most cases, you would say Malay woman, Malay girl, Javanese woman, Javanese girl, Sumatran woman, Sumatran girl. So it's actually a very interesting thing that reminds us that colonialism is also gendered. The way in which colonial subjects, colonized men and colonized women, are not seen alike. They're treated differently according to their economic function. And women often are seen as not having an economic function. Okay? The other interesting thing about the postcards of Southeast Asian women is that if you compare the postcards of African women, especially French postcards of African women, French postcards of African women tended to be on the verge of pornography. Yeah? Because often, if you look, there are thousands of these postcards, you can find them online, right? Thousands of these postcards, especially from the French colonies, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. There was this obsession with seeing the woman behind the veil, right? Behind the veil. And so often, Western postcards, especially French postcards of North African women, would have them undressed, either completely naked or half naked. Now the interesting thing is, in Southeast Asia, when you look at French postcards from Indochina, British postcards from Burma and Malaya and Singapore, Dutch postcards from Indonesia, women are covered, women are clothed. Yeah? So that is interesting. I don't have an explanation. I don't know why. Why is it that Southeast Asian women were treated with more respect compared to African women? Yeah? But this again also tells us something about the dynamics of race. Yeah? So in the hierarchy of races at the time, especially at a time when Africans were regarded as being at the bottom, right? This deliberate and systematic tendency to denude African women, in a very humiliating way, tells us something about the kind of racial hierarchies that were at work. Yes, Asians are inferior to Europeans, but they're superior to Africans. So you have this sort of very violent racialized hierarchies at work, and they are depicted in the postcards. So back to the postcards, like I said, the point I'm trying to make is a simple one. These postcards are not just postcards. If we understand the context of how racialized colonial capitalism worked at the time, then these postcards are actually symptomatic. They tell us, they show us how these understandings of racial difference, gender difference, class difference get depicted in pictorial form. Then the question of Raden Saleh and production. Now this is a difficult one, right? Slightly long answer to this. Of course, it's a question of clientele, right? And you can say that who's Raden Saleh painting for? Well, he's also painting to appease the West. Yeah? He's trying to say, look at what I can do, right? But for me, this is a difficult question to answer because we don't know where to get into the answer. If we see Raden Saleh only as a colonial subject, then we see his work as a colonial subject. We might see his work as a colonial subject saying to the colonial master, you see, I'm as good as you, I'm not inferior. But if we see Raden Saleh as a painter, then we can also read his work as him saying to other painters, I'm just as good as you, if not better. Right? So again, it's a question of register, of where we place. And I think this is why Raden Saleh remains enigmatic, because it's not his paintings that's a dispute. What we dispute, what we question is, where do we put him? Right? Where do we put him? Is he a colonial subject, trying to impress the colonial power? Or is he a colonial subject engaging with the colonial power? And that's the whole point about colonialism. That's what I mean. That's how colonialism lasts. That's how it becomes enmeshed, because we get entangled, like it or not. Let's imagine that this is the 19th century, right? You take that clock, you just push it back to 19th century. Yes, so it's not 2024. It's 1824. If this was 1824, well, first of all, none of us will be here. We'll all be outside, yeah, cutting the grass, tanam padi and all that, right? Yeah. So now, in that context, if we place ourselves in the context of that time, if you were to say, you know what, the Dutch Empire can go to hell, I'm leaving, where are you going to live? What, you go to Pacitan? Right? Where are you going to live? You cannot find a place outside that system. You cannot find a place outside, because this is the thing with hegemony, right? Because it has already defined all the terms. If you put yourself outside, you're still defined by it. You're defined as the backward, the savage, the other. You see, you can't get out of it. So the dilemma of people, not only Raden Saleh, but our intellectuals, our writers, you are engaging with empire, and this raises the question, how do you fight something without becoming the thing you're fighting? Right? How do you fight the thing without becoming the thing you're fighting? Nationalism itself is part of the Western political experience. Yeah? So you rise against colonial rule through nationalism, and you're using nationalism, which is something that we inherited through the experience of colonialism to undermine colonialism. You see, we are enmeshed. And that's why we must be careful as historians. We mustn't write simple histories, because history is messy. Yeah? Messy, it's rojak, gado-gado, it's messy, it's not clean. So no matter how you eat it, you get the kuah on your baju. Yeah? You cannot get rid of it, because that is the process. And that's why history is also subtle and interesting and complex. And the history of Indonesia is complex, and it deserves a complex history. So when we look, whether it's Raden Saleh or whether it's any of the intellectuals and nationalists, same question. Right? Are you collaborating with empire by using the language of nationalism against empire? And if you use the language of nationalism, then doesn't that mean you're also a colonial subject? So you can't get out of it. So we're caught in it. And that for me then becomes the real question, right? Where do we place Raden Saleh? Where do we place Raden Saleh? And I don't think that question can ever be fully answered. And we don't need a full answer, because every generation will have its own Raden Saleh, right? So Raden Saleh in the 40s meant something. Raden Saleh in the 60s meant something. Raden Saleh in the 90s meant something. And Raden Saleh today is on Netflix. Right? Right? So you see, even that is also interesting. 20 years from now, there will be another Raden Saleh, because that generation will have its interpretation. That's history. That's why it's great. That's why history as a discipline cannot die. We all have jobs for life, right? And because that's the great thing about history. It continues, it continues, it continues. So, it's a good question because it can't be answered. And I don't think we need to give it a final answer, because I don't think it's the historian's job to write final histories. That's why, by the way, when you look at Raffles' book, you compare that to the books by Crawford. Crawford writes a history of the East Indian archipelago, a history. Raffles writes the history of Java. When you write the history of Java, it means this is it. This is the only history. There's no other history. This is the history of Java. When Crawford writes a history of the East Indian archipelago, it means it's a history. There are other histories. So the way we write, I don't write I don't use I use a. I cannot write a complete total history. That would be dangerous, because if I write a complete total history, history comes to an end. And then we have no more jobs to do, right? So don't kill history. Keep it alive and keep the debate going. And I think these debates are interesting. You see, like the questions here are more interesting than my talk, because the questions show us how these things, simple pieces of card, can still be discussed today, and they can continue to be discussed in years to come.
This is very interesting, and we really feel like we want to go on and on, right? Especially when we're talking about.
I need a cigarette. I have to stop.
Can you hold on for a moment? All right, maybe we can accommodate one last question, but probably you because you were already. So please make it very short, because we are also soon to have Fridays.
Yes, thank you. My name is Randy. I'm from, unlike the others maybe, I'm from Visible, UIII. And always, first, thank you for really interesting presentation. My question is this. I think it's really interesting to see postcard as a medium to normalize so-called colonial mentality. And my question is, has it always been like that? Or whether there is an instances where, or critical juncture where postcard becomes a medium for contestation. Take an example, we know that a lot of book written to strengthen the colonial mentality, but there's also multatuli, right? That acts as a place for contestation, and whereby colonial at least was questioned, and how you can elaborate on that? Thank you.
Again, when we look at postcards, colonial postcards, yeah, I mean, if you see this as the whole world of postcards, colonial postcards are just this much. Remember, postcards are really a Western phenomenon. You know, they are really circulating in the West, and they're basically about the West. But then you have like this niche area where you have colonial postcards of Asia and Africa. Now, unlike literature, you mentioned Multatuli, right? I think in postcards you don't have that. But what we do have, like in the case of Europe, a very good example would be the 1871 war between Prussia and France. Yeah? Prussia and France go to war. And at that time, on the French side and on the Prussian side, both sides were producing postcards, patriotic postcards, to demonize the other. So French postcards portraying Germans, Prussians as savages and barbarians, and Prussians doing the same to the French. But we don't have that happening here. We don't have like local, indigenous, native postcard producers producing postcards condemning colonial rule. Not in India, not in Malaya. I think that's why, again, in terms of postcard production and photography, it was very much a niche. There were not that many. But we know, of course, that in the world of letters, but what's the first thing that happens? The moment the printing press comes to Asia, it's first brought to Singapore, and then all the other communities begin to buy it. We produce journals and magazines and later newspapers to criticize. So I think there, in that domain, you see more. Postcard production doesn't really take off as a tool of resistance. So that's the only answer. The one weird exception is this. In the case of Malaya, later on when you get to the 1930s, you begin to see Japanese postcard producers. Japanese, because a lot of Japanese were very interested. The Japanese were coming to Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and they were making postcards. And they were also making the same kind of postcards of towns, bridges, and all that. The urban myth is that many of these Japanese postcard producers were actually working for Japanese intelligence before World War II. Because just before World War II, suddenly they all went back to Japan. Why? Because they photographed the whole British Empire already, which becomes very useful. Now, I don't know how much of this is true, but I remember looking at the map archives in Tokyo, and Japanese had done very thorough mapping of Vietnam, Indochina, because the Japanese army understood that if you're going to conquer Southeast Asia, Vietnam is actually the most important country, because once you get Vietnam, Japanese planes can go all the way to Malaya, Singapore, Borneo, so you must get Vietnam. So the Japanese later became very active in photography and cartography. But whether this is anti-empire, you don't know, because the Japanese are also imperialists. This is one empire fighting another empire. But in terms of like local Malayan or Burmese or Indian or Indonesian postcard producers producing nationalist anti-colonial postcards, I've not come across. I'm not saying that there isn't, but I don't think there was much in that way. It's more in the domain of magazines and newspapers. Now it's time for me to hook up.
All right. Although we do not try to propagate robot. Thank you very much, Farish. Just from all these lectures, that one takeaway probably that I can highlight here is that this postcard actually provide evidence of selective culture, one, and also colonial practices, and actually also the emergence of a new class, which is a middle class, because most of the postcards are made by middle class or elite, but then also selected cultures. That I think what you were repeating over during the lecture was about how the indigenous were being portrayed, the kind of culture. So we can also find many pictures of local celebrations, the native celebrations, which usually displayed, whether it is for exercising, but this is, I think there's a selective process in what kind of picture they want to display. And I think that is not just a simple decision, but it is also a political decision to what it should be presenting to the audiences in the colonized country. So I think with that we would like to conclude this lecture. So again, thank you very much for your presence here, and we are looking forward for your coming again to our history department, bringing your new book. He had finished 4 books last year, so I think he has been working tremendously. So I cannot imagine how to finish 4 books in a year. So yeah, so we can replicate that spirit. So please join me to give a round of applause to. And we would like to thank you for your coming to our history department's event. This is quite regularly that history department has public lectures and also visiting lecturers here. So please watch for our social media, Instagram, or do we also have Facebook? I'm not really on Facebook, so I don't know if history department is also existing on Facebook. But yeah, we are quite active on Instagram. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you again to our in our next event.